Welcome to Philosophy 3400, Ethics. Today we're going to be discussing Lecture 11 by Theodor Adorno from his Problems of Moral Philosophy. This lecture is an introduction, in some ways, to Kant's moral philosophy. So if we look on page 110 at the very beginning of this lecture, and incidentally these lectures are from the early 1960s. I was puzzling over this in a previous lecture, and of course the answer is staring me right in the face at the beginning of each lecture. You have the date. So my timeline with Adorno's biography is a little bit off. It's tricky because, he was already back in Germany apparently in the early 50s, though he was still publishing things in English that drew on his time in America. And so there's kind of a gray zone for me. From like the late 40s basically to the early 50s. He's back in Germany, but he's still working on some of the research that he was doing in the United States. Anyhow, and so that threw everything else off for me a little bit when he said it had been 14 years since he returned. Nonetheless, here we are in the early 60s. Of course, this is also a reminder the New Left was prominent in Europe, even here in the United States, earlier than we often think. The early 60s, early and mid 60s certainly, though for many folks with, looking back on history, you often only learn about these protest movements and student activism, as something that occurs in the late 60s and early 70s. And it was there years before that in the United States and in Europe as well, and around the world, really. And so there are already militant activist students prior to the hippies, let's put it, and the counterculture that we associate with the late 60s. Okay. And, I'm thinking of groups like the Students for Democratic Society in the United States, and just, how there was a whole generation of activists that kind of cut their teeth on the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 60s. They were already active on campuses in the early and mid-60s in the United States, doing things like the Freedom Riders and various kinds of civil rights protesting and whatnot. And so anyways, all just to say, we are in the early 60s here with Adorno. If we look on page 110 at the beginning of Lecture 11, the principle of moral action in Kant is really nothing but reason itself, Adorno writes. Reason, moreover, that has freed itself from all the restrictions of particular ends. We're not concerned with consequences and what you're aiming at. And that in general proceeds only in accordance with the most universal matters of substance, right? It's not that complicated, ultimately. On the bottom, page 111, what is needed for right action is not any reflection about reason, but immediate action in accordance with reason and the logical consistency of reason. It's possible to interpret Kant as meaning that the moral is self-evident. So let's just think about this in terms of, a simple example I can think of here. And how Kant's moral philosophy works here, and why Adorno's characterizing it as reason itself and logical consistency. Let's imagine you are driving a vehicle here in Stanislaus County in the middle of the night, and you come across a four-way stop signs, in every direction. Many folks might, interpret this as, these stop signs in the middle of the night on a sort of isolated country road are not to be taken seriously, perhaps. And they, do you stop? Do you come to a complete stop at a four-way stop in the middle of the night if there are no other cars in sight, or not? Now, for Kant, right, the right thing to do here is entirely simple. There's a reason why you have these stop signs for each direction. There's a reason you have a four-way stop there. And it's mainly because people who study traffic and do traffic engineering have determined that, that to allow people more discretion in that situation would lead to more injuries and fatalities and crashes. And so it's the safest thing to do there. And it's quite simple, right? What are the rules here? You come, if you see a stop sign, you come to a complete stop, you look based on sort of who's there first and whatnot. You then proceed after coming to a complete stop, right? So in other words, what's the right thing to do when you're driving? You come to a stop sign. The right thing to do is to stop. And here's the deal for Kant, right? It's reason itself, right? And it has to do with universal matters of substance. So it's not so much, what do I do? You know, Professor Turner, I'm driving from Turlock to Denair. It's the middle of the night, come to a four-way stop. For Kant, it's all irrelevant, like who I am and what I'm trying to do. I'm in a hurry, I got to get somewhere. A friend, a party that's happening, it's going to be over soon, or whatever. None of that matters, right? You just simply do the right thing to do. And why is it right to stop at the stop sign? Because that's how we all are able to operate private vehicles safely together. And something like, you know, the stop sign is also a reminder that this is a situation where we've deemed it advisable for everyone in this situation to stop, not to exercise discretion. Now, you can have a situation where you exercise discretion if, for instance, you were to have a yield sign there instead of a stop sign. Now you, of course, don't have to stop unless there's someone coming, and then you do stop and yield to them, right? But you have a kind of discretion built into that. So in any case, the idea here is something like, for anybody who is driving, whether or not you see other vehicles in other directions, if you come to a four-way stop, you stop and then you go. You come to any stop sign, you come to a complete stop and then you go. And there is a reason for this. This is what facilitates, this is what allows people to safely operate private vehicles with other folks operating private vehicles. Something like that, right? Is what we must do in a community where a number of people are all driving their own vehicles at the same time and going in various directions. Anyways, right, the idea is it's fairly simple here. You, me, anyone in that situation, there's a right thing to do, a wrong thing to do the right thing, etc., right? And if you don't do the right thing, you can get in trouble, or you can also get into an accident. And the idea here is to just be consistent, okay? There's never a situation where you shouldn't come to the stop, to a complete stop at the stop sign. Now, of course, now we can already begin to problematize Kant's approach here, right? We can say, well, what if there's a person in the vehicle, they're pregnant, they're going to deliver a baby here shortly, we got to get to the hospital, there's nobody around. Now, Kant would say, it doesn't matter. You got to stop at the stop sign. It's the right thing to do. It's the consistent thing to do. It's the logical thing to do. Many of us would say that's very nice, Kant, but if we're driving in this situation, come to a four-way stop in the middle of the night, this person who's pregnant or having some medical emergency of some kind, for instance, in the vehicle, we are not going to stop at that stop sign unless there are other vehicles, right, that we could potentially crash into. Otherwise, we're going to just cruise right through that stop sign and hurry up and try to get to the hospital, etc. Okay, so I just want us to think. Kant's approach is fairly simple in a sense. Be reasonable, do the reasonable thing. The reasonable thing is the same for you as it is for anyone else in that situation. What you're trying to get out of some situation, irrelevant. There's a right way to do something, a wrong way. And the right way to do it is the way that everyone can do it in a manner that's consistent, right? And doesn't turn certain people into exceptions to the rule. So, just an interesting way to open here. On the top of page 112, Adorno is going to talk about an identification of knowledge and virtue. And he says what is problematic about identifying knowledge and virtue, right? Just use your reason well, act in such a way that anybody else in that situation would act the same way you are. It's the only sort of way to act that's consistent and fair for everyone involved. Well, according to Adorno, a decisive element in moral action disappears when we are identifying knowledge and virtue, when we identify sort of proper reasoning and logical consistency with virtue. A decisive element in moral action disappears. That element is the transition from moral consciousness to moral action. Now, in an earlier lecture that we talked about earlier in the semester, Adorno talks about a sort of moment of spontaneity, right? A moment when people realize, I can't take this anymore. Something must change. There's an injustice. It's unacceptable. This is another way to talk about this. How do we get from this moment of moral consciousness to moral action, right? When does it dawn on people that some injustice, has happened and must be stopped, right? It's not enough to just know what the right thing to do is and just to do it always the same way in every case. Our lives are more complicated than this simple example of a four-way stop in the middle of the night. So this element of transition from moral consciousness to moral action, what impels people to do something? One substantial objection, Adorno writes, to the identification of morality with reason is the fact that I have the right consciousness does not at all imply that I shall act in accordance with that right consciousness. Right? And so this is another way to get at what Aristotle has characterized as akrasia, right? We can know the right thing, what the right thing to do is, and fail to do it. We can also know that something is wrong and find ourselves unable, or at least tell ourselves we're unable to resist the impulse to do it. So, fair enough, Adorno, you're raising Aristotle's objection to Plato's Socratic intellectualism here, and you're not wrong. One substantial objection, right, is just because I have the right consciousness doesn't mean I'll act in accordance with that right consciousness. I can know that something is unjust without doing what I need to do about it, right, without being impelled to do something to change it. Moreover, he says, the more an antagonism develops in society between the interests and ends of particular individuals, let's call them billionaires, and the interests and ends of society as a whole, the harder it is to postulate the existence of any such immediate identity. So there is an antagonism here between the interests of certain individuals who own more wealth than the rest of the population of the world all combined together, and the ends of society as a whole, right? Things like, wouldn't it be nice if everybody could go to the doctor without worrying about cost? Or didn't have to worry about being evicted from their homes or apartments in the middle of a pandemic that has cost many people their jobs. These would be interests and ends of society as a whole. Everybody would benefit from such policies. Anybody who's ever going to be in a precarious situation where they may be financially strapped, of course, would benefit from something like access to quality health care for free, or at least not having to worry about how you're going to make ends meet and pay for medical procedures, for example, right? Whereas there's interests and ends of particular individuals, which is, I've got mine, and I don't want anybody else to take anything away from me, even though I have as much as, 4 billion other people on the face of the earth all combined. I'm thinking of somebody like Jeff Bezos, who has just stepped away or is going to step away from his role as CEO of Amazon, or Elon Musk, who controls a frightening number of his company, whatever it is, controls a scary percentage of the total satellites up in the sky. A lot of power for one person to have, and these people have their own specific interests, growing their wealth, as they call it, right? Or as the hedge fund manager put it last week, who was, trying to destroy GameStop. I'm just trying to earn a living here by ruining entire businesses, so by speculating on the stock market, by playing with other people's lives and fortunes. So we have an antagonism between the interests and ends of particular individuals and the interests and ends of society as a whole. And the more this antagonism develops, and this antagonism, we have this sense that somehow it starts off bad and gets worse over time or something, but with the history of capitalism over the past few hundred years, what we see is just, every 8 years or so there's some so-called crisis. And, if it's happening every 8 to 10 years or so, it's hard to imagine how it is some sort of unforeseen crisis. But nonetheless, these crises happen, and that's when this kind of antagonism explodes. It's happening right now. Now, the more this happens, Adorno writes, the harder it is to postulate the existence of any such immediate identity of knowledge and virtue. Right? Okay, now, this brings Adorno back to the question, the problem of theory and practice, which he writes about at the bottom of page 112 here, and he says, what I want to say about this famous problem with theory and practice, what is the relation between the two? Can you have one of them right and the other one wrong? They necessarily rise and fall together. What's going on here? How can somebody have theoretical knowledge and yet be practically useless? How can people be very effective practically and completely lacking in theoretical insight and whatnot? What I want to say about this famous problem of theory and practice, towards the bottom of page 112, which has again become a burning issue today, is that wherever people possess or imagine that they possess a true theoretical consciousness, they find that they are prevented from following its logic through in practice. Partly at least because the problem has its own historical implications. That is to say, the problem of the disjunction between consciousness and action only comes to the surface in a world in which the individual is a being for himself, who has become clearly detached from objective social reality and even stands out as its antithesis. Okay, we can see this clearly, Adorno writes, in the great artistic products of the Renaissance. Okay. And so, what is he getting at here? You can have a true theoretical consciousness. You can understand at the highest level for your time, your historical era, what is really going on. However, that doesn't translate into being able to intervene in practice effectively. This is not wrong. Not wrong at all. And it's interesting, right? Like, why? It would seem like if you had this theoretical consciousness, if you really understood what was really happening in a situation, you would be in a better position to intervene effectively in a practical sense in that situation. And yet he's saying that is not the case any longer, at least from a certain point where societies become increasingly complex and increasingly larger. For the last few hundred years at least. What I'm referring to here, he says at the bottom of 112, is the fact that people suffer from their knowledge because they discover that no direct path leads from knowledge to practice. Instead, they stand in need of a third thing, something besides knowledge, something besides practice, namely that injection of irrationality, something no longer reducible to reason, what he calls the spontaneous kind of element of a refusal to continue going along with the status quo. There are really many situations when you really don't and can't know the answer to the question, what shall I do? And that is the horrible truth, Adorno thinks, right, about history. These answers are not, there are situations where there is no clear answer to this question, no matter how much you think about it, or no matter how active you are, right? You can try a variety of things and still, right? In other words, you can be very practically focused and you can be experimental, and if this doesn't work, I'll try that, and you can still fail miserably. So, let's look at his attempt to sort of rescue Kant here and argue that Kant is not entirely wrong in this equation of knowledge and virtue. There is some truth in this Kantian conception of the rational nature of right action, notwithstanding its blind spot, the defect that simply cannot be eradicated, which again, right, is sometimes we can have this rational nature, exercise, use it well, develop it well, and still not be capable of the right action in certain situations. And so, the element of truth is, as I attempted to explain to you last time, that only insight, non-blindness, in other words, only self-reflection is capable of raising human subjects out of their purely natural context. And so, right, the idea is, yes, we do need to develop our rational nature, and even if it doesn't give us the answer, what shall I do right now in this situation, there's no way to get to right action except through theory, even if theory doesn't guarantee you the right action in all situations. Right, you have to choose blindness or non-blindness, right? The natural context or a theoretical approach, accepting everything in your surroundings that is given and that is present and that has been there as natural and normal and not to be questioned, or waking up and taking a different perspective on things by the theoretical approach, which I would equate to something like a bird's eye view, standing above the given and above a purely natural context, and getting a broader perspective informed by history and by science. Okay, so we can pinpoint, Adorno claims, the element of non-identity. The element of non-identity. It's a fruitful kind of non-identity here between knowledge and virtue, between theoretical insight and the right thing to do in a situation. They are not identical, they are not correlated. It is not the case that if you have one, you have the other. Instead, there's a tension here. We can pinpoint the element of non-identity by saying that in practical philosophy, that is, in Kant's writings on moral philosophy, the moral law is indeed conceived as a strict law, right? You must always stop at that four-way stop sign. I don't care if it's 2 in the morning and there hasn't been anybody on that road for an hour. It's the right thing to do. Moral law is conceived as a strict law, but as a law that merely prescribes what should be the case. It says nothing at all about what is in fact the case. In other words, and Kant is aware of this too, right? That's what you should do. That is the right thing to do, and it's not complicated, right? However, that idea that anytime you come to a four-way stop, you must come to a complete stop, even in the middle of the night, even if nobody's around. That is the moral imperative there, but guess what? It says nothing at all about what is in fact the case. Let me tell you what is in fact the case here in California. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody coming to a complete stop at a four-way stop in some rural stretch of road in the middle of the night with nobody else around. And if you found somebody like that, you might want to give them a prize, right? That's how rare it is. So we can have this moral imperative be fairly clear and understandable and logically consistent, and yet it's not really telling us about what is in fact the case in the world we do live in. It's telling us what should be the case. Accordingly, he says, we find that even in the theory, the gap persists between moral law and moral practice that I have just been attempting to represent to you as a necessary component of the theory. So even in this theory, Adorno is claiming, Kant's moral theory, there's a gap between moral law and moral practice. It is to be found in those assertions in Kant's practical philosophy that describe the categorical imperative and the moral laws in general as obligation. Right? Obligation, Nötigung. That is to say, these laws do indeed possess the character of a third thing, the form of necessity. Since according to Kant, they can confront us in such a way that as rational actors, we cannot but comply with them. And that's, true of this stop sign, right? Like, here's the deal. Maybe you, the thing there is that it is also an expression of an obligation. You are required by law to stop, right? If you don't, you are subject to a legal penalty. And there's an example of how obligation comes in. Now this creates a situation where you may know that stopping at the four-way is the right thing to do. You may also not want to do it because you're in a hurry and nobody's around, but you may still be compelled to do it out of this obligation, this sense that I don't know for sure if there isn't perhaps a police officer secretly observing me, or a camera or something, right? Or some sort of detection that may catch me doing this, and that's a reminder, right? There's an obligation here. As to say, he says, so anyways, yeah, these moral imperatives have the form of necessity, and there's something kind of compulsive there. Kant, views this as an expression of our autonomy. As reasoning beings, we can come to understand the reasons why we should behave this way, and why everyone in this situation should do as we are doing. Okay? However, there's also this moment of obligation. If, and the idea here is, if I don't behave in a consistent way, I am failing to meet my obligations towards others. I'm being selfish, essentially. So, and Adorno's pointing out this moment of necessity in the moral imperative is a reminder, right, that this is a law. Even if it's not telling us how the world actually is, it's telling us that if most people aren't doing what they should be doing, right, it's, they are violating a law, right? Whether that law is written on the books or not, for Kant, right? It doesn't even have to be written on the books. Even if there wasn't 4 stop signs there, you would be sort of morally obligated anytime you come to a 4-way intersection like that to come to a stop and sort of negotiate peacefully and civilly with the other drivers there some method for all of you making it through there, safely and with a kind of consideration. Maybe whoever was there first can go first, and etc. In other words, it's really just all the traffic law is doing there and the signs are doing is sort of making it evident and visible what right reason would tell us to do in that situation. And so I think what Adorno is cluing into here is there's a sense in which we should be able to figure this out for ourselves, and in doing it should be realizing our rational nature. But there's another sense in which the way the world really works for many of us, we don't perhaps understand why this is how things need to be, and we experience these kinds of laws perhaps, or customs, as obligatory, as binding, and perhaps as alien and frustrating, right? Why do I have to do this? I don't want to do it. Nobody else is around. Why should I have to be considerate? But as Kant repeatedly reminds us, and now into the top of 114, these moral imperatives are not natural laws. They're not laws about existing phenomena. They're propositions about what ought to exist. So the fact, that there's not a lot of people doing what they should do is no evidence in favor of the fact that what they should do is less real. It's just that when we're talking about moral phenomena and moral imperatives here, we are talking necessarily about what should exist. And it's okay if what should exist currently is not what generally does exist. Because there's a problem on our hands, but it's not evidence that our conception of what should exist is somehow misguided. We don't take our cues from whatever sort of given arrangement is already in place as though simply because some custom exists, it's inherently reasonable. Anyways, Adorno's going to go on. He says, look, remains unclear whether or not we really act in accordance with these laws. That is, we never, and this is for Kant, right? For this to be a moral action, we must be animated by a good will. But the reality is, in these situations, we never really know for sure if we are or if others are. So I come to, when I come to the complete stop at that 4-way stop sign, I may have a nice expression on my face. I may not be swearing at anybody, but it's entirely possible that I'm only doing what I'm doing there because of my fears of being in trouble for not doing what I'm supposed to, and that I actually resent, right, the heck out of having to do it, and I resent everybody else who gets to go ahead of me at the stop and whatnot, right? In other words, I can seem to be doing the right thing, but I can have the wrong state of mind, a state of mind of resentment and frustration, and I can also be the sort of person who would not do what I'm supposed to do the moment I feel like nobody is watching or checking or making sure of it, right? And that would be evidence that, right, evidence that we never really know for sure when somebody does the right thing, whether they're actually doing it for the right reasons or whether they're doing it for the wrong reasons. Right? What are the wrong reasons? I'm doing it not because I actually know that it's the right thing to do, and not because I'm a good person. I'm doing it because I want you to believe that I'm a good person. I'm actually a terrible person, but by occasionally doing the right thing in front of other people, I convince those other people, right, that they can trust me, and then I use that to my advantage, for example, right? Okay. So, let's keep pushing through here. When we talk of the prescriptive character of reason, right, that reason can sort of tell us what we should do, even if that's really at odds with what is generally already happening as a matter of course in the world. When we talk about the prescriptive character of reason, its nature as an imperative, right? You should do this, right? It's like the 10 Commandments in the Bible, right? The reason they exist is because a lot of people were breaking those commandments, right? And so you have the nature of an imperative here. This is what you should do. Thou shalt do this. But a sort of background piece of information there is, those kinds of imperatives generally occur when people are generally not doing what they're being told to do. That's why it's the motivation for the imperative in the first place. So when we talk about the prescriptive character of reason, Adorno argues here on page 114, its nature as an imperative, what you need to understand is that there has been a crucial change from the concept of reason in antiquity. So what is this crucial change? Well, reason has now ceased to be merely the ability to form the correct concepts and to articulate concepts in accordance with the nature of the matter to be analyzed in the manner you find illustrated in Platonic dialectic itself. So here reason is a matter of, clearly forming the right concepts. How do we know they're right? We talk with other people, we sort out different candidates, hypotheses, we rule some of them out on the basis of their contradictions, and gradually, right, we come to sort of sharpen and focus our understanding of a given concept, and then we get closer to the truth of the matter. Now he says instead, though, things have changed. He says, from antiquity to the modern era, instead, reason in Kant is what we might call a productive faculty, a kind of activity, as opposed to just recognizing what's already real and true, right? And all we do is we sort of recognize it with our minds after we have this really long conversation with Socrates and his friends. Instead, he says, reason in Kant is what we may call productive. The entire argument about the autonomy of its laws is based on this idea of reason as an activity, in the sense that my reason does not simply lead me to acquiesce passively in these laws. And that is happening to a great degree. Most people driving around on the roads are acquiescing passively to the rules of the road. They'd much rather just kind of zip all over the place using their own private discretion. And if enough of them did that all at the same time, we'd all be getting killed out there on the roads, because it would turn into a giant racetrack. And so, right, but for Kant, we need to be active in this process. We need to use our reason to recognize what is sort of universally valid for any rational agent in a given situation. And that requires us to actively think through the rationale of what we're doing. Self-reflection, right? And so even if we end up, and the idea how this is supposed to work, right, is I'm supposed to actively then reason. This is why I come to a complete stop at this stop sign, whether or not I actually see somebody coming, from a different direction or something like this. Okay. So I'm not supposed to just acquiesce passively to the universal truth and to the categorical imperative, right, such as don't lie, don't ever lie. I'm not just supposed to constantly feel like that's a voice in my head and I just have to obey it, right? What I'm supposed to do is actively reason and realize why telling a lie in any situation is never the right thing to do. And believe me, I tried to do that and it simply didn't work out for me. I can think of some cases where telling a lie actually is the right thing to do, and that's the whole problem. In any case, though, let's look at the bottom of 114 here. He says this problem that we're identifying here, right, with this kind of tension between activity and passivity in our reasoning, our moral reasoning, Kant is going to go on here on the bottom of 114 to continue to get us to think a little bit more critically about what he's talking about here. So hold on just a second. All right, pardon me there. So what is this affinity of Kant's conception of reason with practice that Adorno is talking about here on the bottom of 114? It's no longer simply the case that I arrive at the knowledge of right action on the basis of a purely rational process, right? A sort of long and careful conversation with others, where we agree on our terms, where we sift through different hypotheses and different answers to a question carefully. Instead, he says this knowledge of what I should do and what the right thing to do is, right, requires me to create the principles on which it is founded. There is no rule book, there's no guidebook, there's no good book I can turn to here that'll have all the answers. We have to do the work of creating the principles on which our moral action is founded. A moment here of existentialism, frankly. Now, reason in Kant, Adorno goes on to claim, reason in Kant means something quite different now from the meaning for the Greeks. It means, and this is the legacy of Rousseau in Kant's practical philosophy, means the possibility of a moral organization of the world of a kind that has never appeared in antiquity. Right? One that is, for instance, not based on a slave economy. so far as I've been able to establish, apart perhaps from certain speculations on the part of leftist strands in Socratic thinking. Thank you, Adorno. This is maybe the one place I've seen in all of Adorno's writings where he suggests that he might be aware that the ancient cynics, for example, anticipated a kind of social movement that we associate with Rousseau and Marx and with consuliberalism, kind of universalism, a universal human community, cosmopolitanism. He might actually be thinking now, so Adorno, following Edward Zeller, a German from the 19th century, is probably thinking here of the Stoics. But if you knew what I know here about the ancient Greeks, he'd mean the ancient cynics here. In any case, leftist strands in Socratic thinking. The reason why the Greeks failed to develop along these lines was that from the outset their concept of reason was far too preoccupied with arranging pre-given material. That's exactly what distinguishes, I think, the cynics from everyone else in ancient Greece at this time. They weren't preoccupied with arranging pre-given material. And that knowledge for them isn't just recognizing what was always true, what is always true, what will always be true, but instead involves this moment of creation, of generation, of spontaneity, of irrationality in a sense. The moment of unreason that belongs to reason. Okay. All right. Let us continue to power through this. And I want to skip ahead here. Skip ahead to page 118, otherwise we'll simply never make it through this in time. Okay, on page 118, I want us to think here about what Adorno calls the fundamental problem of Kantian ethics. This fundamental problem, according to Adorno, of Kantian ethics is autonomy. Right? We've already thought about this, like how do you arrive at your understanding of the moral imperative? You're supposed to actively reason for yourself and arrive at rules that hold for anybody under this situation to act in a consistent manner. And yet, as we've seen, we never really know for sure who has done this and who hasn't, who is doing the right thing for the right reasons and because they've actively supported what they're doing with their own reasoning, and who's just doing it because it's what you have to do. Who's in this class, for instance, to actually learn something about ethics? Who is here just to earn a college credit? You'd be in this class, you'd be in another class if it worked better for your schedule. You'd just be in any class, whatever, and do whatever the professor wants you to do to get the credit, to finish the major, to get the degree, to get the job, to earn the money. That's all heteronomy. But autonomy would be, hey, this is actually, I understand why I'm in these classes. And even though I'm going to go on to do this for a living, it was nice to learn something about the history of theater, right? Even though I'm not going to go on to work in a theater or something. Anyways, the fundamental problem of Kantian ethics, autonomy, its opposite, heteronomy. Heteronomy, much more evident in the given world that we inhabit, whereas autonomy is something that should be the case for all of us, and yet rarely is the case, at least until now. For Kant, Adorno writes, the idea of autonomy, and this is the bottom of page 118 here. In Kant, the idea of autonomy contains from the outset the idea of universality. In other words, what is good for me is also what's good for anybody else, any other rational agent in this situation. I come to a complete stop at the four-way stop. Anybody should. That's how this works here, this thing we call driving private automobiles around on the roads without killing each other unnecessarily. So, the idea of autonomy contains from the outset the idea of universality. However, this concept of and the idea here too, right, in becoming autonomous and reasoning autonomously, we turn ourselves into a sort of universal human being. We elevate ourselves from some particular given person with these characteristics at this time, with all these prejudices and shortcomings, into a sort of universal human being. Anybody else would be just like us. We are as good as anybody. Beethoven, Mozart, and every hero you can imagine from the history of culture and civilization, Gandhi and Martin Luther King or whoever, they would all do that same thing. We are like them in this regard, okay? Jesus Christ himself would do the same thing in this situation, right? So here I am, sort of raising myself to this universal level of humanity in doing the right thing for the right reasons. Okay, however, he says, this concept of universality is heavily loaded in the sense that the law I give myself is not concerned simply with my own personal needs. That's right. Or inclinations, right? I might be in a hurry, right? There's a party going on. I want to make it to my friend's house. And if I don't get there in time, it might be over. People might be leaving or something. That's why I don't want to stop at the stop sign, right? So in other words, having to come to that complete stop or something is a real burden and a pain, and it's not satisfying my personal need. So the law that I give myself is not concerned simply with my own personal needs or inclinations or the chance nature of my individuality. Instead, the law must be universal, and this means for Kant that the law I give myself must be of such a kind that I can imagine it as the foundation of a universal legislation. That is, as a legislation that does not violate the freedom and autonomy of other individuals. And so here we have it, right? In thinking what the right thing for me to do is, I must necessarily think of others. I must come up with a conception of right action that is consistent with the action of others attempting to do the same thing I am. And so what this means is I'm trying to get from point A to point B on the road, and guess what? So are other people. And that's why I don't get to basically ignore other people and their needs and what they're doing while I engage in what I'm doing. Now, how we experience this is a burden. Am I sacrificing my needs and what I'm after so that they can have what they are after? No. What's actually happening is we're all, in a sense, limiting ourselves so that we can all be as free as possible together. Right? That's the idea. And that's what it means to exercise autonomous reason. Heteronomy is going to be the opposite of that. And that's going to be getting your instructions from some leader or some authority figure, generally being manipulated by that person. And as he puts it, heteronomy is the law that is imposed on me by others. I receive it without its being a law given to me by my own reason. I do it because he said so, right? Or she said so, is what Trump said, so therefore it's the right thing to do. That is textbook heteronomy in the name of thinking for yourself. Couldn't get more Orwellian than that. And it's no longer 1984, this is 2021. So, if I do not give myself laws, if I am not involved in sort of the activity of reasoning that leads to an articulation of what should be the case for me and anyone else, if I do not act in accordance with the laws of my own reason, I make myself dependent on heteronomy, on laws that hold good outside myself, and I thereby become unfree. This concept of heteronomy, of getting your laws from another, literally, in Kant does not refer merely to unfreedom in a political sense, although of course it can. In other words, to the need to adjust blindly to norms imposed on me by others. It also refers to restrictions on my reason of whatever kind. This includes my own instincts, my own needs, can restrict my own reasoning, right? As well as any constraints on my civic freedom by external factors of every kind, whatever their source. Okay. Now, it is precisely here, Adorno writes, that Kant finds himself completely agreeing with the classical tradition and with this ancient Greek conception of eleutheria, freedom, right? Freedom from tutelage, freedom from dependence on others. Here we are. We have a mention of the Cynics, and so I think Adorno was thinking of them when he talks about these left-wing Socratics here. The task of freeing ourselves from our emotions, freeing ourselves from our dependence on our emotions, from being manipulated by people playing on our emotions. This task of freeing ourselves from from being governed by our own emotions and being governed by those who can manipulate our emotions skillfully. The task of freeing ourselves from these formed part of the teaching of the Cynics in the earlier phase of Greek philosophy and of the first generation of Stoics in the classical period. Hence we can say that this twofold meaning of the concept of freedom, of outer freedom, which is crucial, and I think, Thomas Hobbes is still our best guide here, right? Freedom is the absence of physical hindrance or obstacle. Can we move around or not physically? And inner freedom, right? Do we feel do we feel like we're doing what we actually want to do? And have we understood and justified to ourselves why we're doing what we're doing, or are we just going along with something because we're afraid or somebody's intimidated or dominated us in some fashion. So, we can say that this twofold meaning, inner and outer freedom, can be said to be a prominent, even dominant theme of the history of philosophy as a whole, and one about which philosophers have agreed, even though in other respects their philosophies are violently opposed to one another. And yes, there's a lot of agreement here that freedom should have both an outer and an inner dimension. I mean, and then there are also schools that emphasize the one or the other aspect here. But also this idea that we must suppress or master or govern our own emotions in order to be free. Certainly in Plato, right, the whole metaphor, visual image for the soul as the sort of reason in the driver's seat, and the emotions as one of the horses being driven, gives us a picture of freedom as requiring the suppression of emotions. At the same time, Adorno claims, you find that this view contains the potential for an extraordinarily damaging dialectic. It sure does, right? What happens when you suppress your emotions for too long, too often? You cease to be able to feel emotions properly. There's also sort of a revenge of the repressed emotions that bubbles up and surfaces and then manifests itself in various neuroses and psychoses, right? You could illustrate what Adorno's getting at here simply with reference to a Showtime television show called Ray Donovan that just ended a year or two ago. Not a great show. But one thing it shows you, right, is a tough guy who's a fixer working for celebrities and the wealthy, solving their various problems when they do something terrible because they're intoxicated or whatnot. And here's a guy who comes in and can fix any problem for you, right? And he's very good at suppressing his emotions, to put it mildly. He has mastered his emotions, keeps them in check constantly, and unleashes rage sort of strategically against the people that he has to punish for various reasons. In any case, there's an extraordinarily damaging dialectic there. This is why the main character, Ray Donovan, played by Liv Schreiber, ends up jumping off a bridge or something to drown himself at the end of one of the last seasons of the show. In other words, the whole kind of arc of the show is, here's a guy who's very tough, so tough that other people hire him to solve problems, illegal problems in many cases. This is a person who can pretty much get anything done for you. And yet here's a person who has suppressed their emotions so much that they become incapable of feeling the emotions they need to feel at certain moments, like when his wife gets cancer and dies, or that he needs to feel about thinking about the childhood trauma of being sexually abused by a priest, which is part of the storyline here of this television show. He's not he has suppressed these emotions and is very effective at his job, but he ends up wishing he were dead and trying to kill himself, right? And so there's a damaging dialectic here, all right? It sometimes gets captured under the heading of toxic masculinity. This is that, but let's see more specifically what Adorno's getting at, right? This is that in the name of freedom, that is, in the name of control over the emotions by consciousness, right? So we must control our emotions to be free as reasonable, rational agents that are not the playthings of our own emotions. In the name of controlling our emotions consciously, the gratification of the instincts and in general happiness of every kind falls victim to a kind of taboo and is banished from philosophy. In other words, when does this pay off for me? When do I get to enjoy what I'm doing? Right? That's just it, right? Is that the gratification of your instincts and any sort of happiness that involves pleasure and actually enjoying what you're doing is going to sort of be put to the side. And so there is this moment of kind of rigor in Kant's moral philosophy, that there's an inhuman moment here, that emotions are irrelevant, that feelings of compassion and pity can be irrelevant. Do not give a handout to that person in need, no matter how pathetic they are, no matter how bad you feel, and how much you want to help them. Because, Kant would say, because what if you kept, giving to every person like this that you met throughout the days and weeks, you would end up bankrupting yourself. Right? So, yeah, sure, good advice. And now I'm never going to bankrupt myself, Con. I'm going to have a nice savings account, but I start to feel bad and terrible that I keep ignoring all these desperate homeless persons who need help. And even though I master my emotions and don't break down crying or something, eventually this will then manifest itself in my life in some terrible fashion. This guilt, this shame, the fact that I'm not recognizing that I have some impulse toward compassion and acting on it, and repressing that to do the responsible thing, right? Okay, I think I've said enough today. I've certainly gone on longer than I intended to. We will let that suffice for our discussion of Adorno's 11th lecture on moral philosophy. Thank you for joining me.